She was 24 years old, and she was looking at the same ghost on every map in the office. A town without a name, marked in the same place, by 7 different cartographers over 40 years, and no road on any current chart that admitted it was there. Charlotte Weaver had spent a year telling herself it was a copyist's error, passed from hand to hand, and then one gray morning she saddled a bay mare, packed a compass her grandfather had left her, and rode out alone to see whether Briar Ridge had ever existed at all. Settle in with us for this one. And before we go any further, let us know where you're watching from tonight. Because what she found, still standing at the end of that ride, is a story that deserves to be told slowly. Charlotte Weaver had been born in a river town called Holloway's Bend, the middle child of a schoolteacher father and a mother who took in mending. And by the time she was 7, she could already read a topographic sheet the way other children read primers. Her father kept an old atlas on the parlor shelf and let her turn its pages on Sunday afternoons, and she learned the vocabulary of contour and legend and scale before she learned long division. There were 4 children in the house, and never quite enough of anything, and Charlotte was the quiet one, the one who noticed which floorboard creaked and which window let in the draft, the one her mother called on to count the eggs and measure the flour, because Charlotte never miscounted and never lied about it if she did. When she was 11, her father took her along on a survey walk, out past the county line, because the county needed a rough sketch of a disputed fence, and he had been asked to make it, and she carried his chain and held the end of his measuring tape without complaining about the sun, and that was the afternoon she understood that a map was not a picture of a place, but a promise about it. A promise that if you followed the lines, you would find the world where the paper said it would be. The mentor came a year after that, when her father took ill through a long winter and could no longer walk the survey lines himself. His name was Otis Kerr, a widowed cartographer in his 60s, who worked out of a narrow room above the feed store and made his living drawing property plats for the land office. He had lost a wife to fever and a son to a river accident, and he lived alone with a black dog and a set of German drafting instruments in a walnut case. And when Charlotte's father asked whether the old man might take on a girl as an errand runner, Otis Kerr looked her over once and said only, "She can hold a pencil straight. That will do." She worked for him from the age of 12 until she was 22, first sweeping the room and inking his rough lines, then plotting bearings from his field notebooks, then walking the lines herself when his knees gave out. He taught her to shoot a compass, to pace out a chain, to correct for magnetic declination, to hatch a slope so it read as a slope to any eye that fell on it. He taught her the names of the old surveyors, whose work still lay under the country like a second skeleton, and he taught her that a good map remembered what people forgot. He rarely praised her aloud. Once, when she had traced a difficult creek bend without a single blot, he set the sheet down and said, "That is a clean piece of work," and she carried the sentence around inside her chest for a week. Otis Kerr died in the spring of her 23rd year, quietly, at his drafting table, with a half-finished plat under his hand. He had left her almost nothing to speak of, because there had been almost nothing to leave. But among the items his sister allowed her to keep was a small brass pocket compass in a leather sleeve, the case scratched and the glass slightly clouded, the needle still true. He had carried it in his vest pocket every day of the 30 years he had walked survey lines, and he had once told her, without looking up from his work, that a compass that had been carried long enough learned the hand that carried it. She kept it in her coat pocket after that, and she touched it the way other women touched a cross at their throat, and she took his old chair at the drafting table when the land office hired her on in his place, because she was the only person in the county who could finish the work he had left behind. She was, by then, a woman of small means and settled habit, unmarried, living in a rented room above a milliner's shop, drawing plats by day and reading old survey journals by lamp at night. She had 2 sisters married off to farmers, and 1 brother gone west to the railheads, and a mother who wrote her twice a year. And no one in her family understood exactly what she did for a living, or why she cared so much about it, and she had stopped trying to explain. The maps were her company. She handled hundreds of them a year, official and private, old and new, and she knew their peculiarities, the way a horse trainer knew the peculiarities of horses. Which was how, in the autumn of her 24th year, sorting a bundle of estate papers that had come in from a deceased judge's library, she began to notice the ghost. A settlement, unnamed, at the head of a valley some 90 miles northwest of Holloway's Bend, in country the current road maps showed as empty. It appeared on a hand-drawn sheet from 1848, and on a lithographed survey from 1861, and on a mining district plat from 1874, and on a post office draft from as late as 1889, and then it simply stopped being drawn, as though the cartographers of the newer generation had all agreed at once to look past it. But the older sheets kept it, and they kept it in the same exact place, and no current route on any modern chart went anywhere near it. And Charlotte Weaver sat at her drafting table one November evening, with 4 of those old maps spread beneath her lamp, and she understood that she was going to have to go and see. She took the 4 maps the next morning to the county recorder, a man named Wilbur Ashe, who had held the post for 18 years, and who prided himself on knowing every acre of the district by heart. And she laid them out on his desk, in the order of their dates, and she pointed to the ghost, at the head of the valley, on each one in turn. Wilbur Ashe was a tidy, gray, unhurried man who wore sleeve garters and drank his coffee cold, and he looked at the 4 maps for what she judged to be about the length of time it took to read a paragraph, and then he told her plainly that it was a copyist's error propagated forward through 4 decades of lazy draftsmen, that no such place existed or had ever existed within his knowledge, and that she would do better to attend to the plats already stacked on her table than to chase phantoms out of estate bundles. He said this without heat and without unkindness, in the same tone he used to inform farmers that their fence was 2 feet over the line. He said that the land office paid her to draw what was there and not what wasn't, and that if she cared to take a personal ride into empty country, on her own time and her own horse, he would not stop her, but that he would consider it a poor use of a promising young draftsman, and that the position she held was not one the county would keep open indefinitely for a woman who wandered. Charlotte Weaver did not argue. She gathered the 4 maps and rolled them and slid them back into their tube and thanked him for his time, and she went back up the stairs to the narrow room above the feed store that had been Otis Kerr's and was now hers, and she sat down at the drafting table with the compass in her pocket, pressing against her hip, and she made her decision the way she made every decision, which was to write it down. She wrote a note to Wilbur Ashe, informing him that she would be absent from the office for a period of not less than 2 weeks and not more than 4, and that she understood the terms he had laid out, and that she accepted them. She signed it, and she blotted it, and she folded it, and she put it in an envelope with his name on the front. Then she paid the milliner 3 months' rent in advance, out of the small sum she had saved from Otis Kerr's back wages, and she left the key with the milliner's daughter, and she wrote to her mother that she was going on a survey trip and would write again when she returned. She packed a canvas bedroll and a tin of coffee, and a sack of hard biscuit, and a wedge of yellow cheese, and a slab of salt pork wrapped in oiled paper, and she packed a spare shirt, and a wool coat, and a slicker, and a fresh pair of socks, and she packed the compass, and the 4 maps, and a fresh notebook, and 2 pencils sharpened to points, and she packed nothing else. She saddled the bay mare in the gray of the following morning, and she rode out of Holloway's Bend without saying goodbye to anyone, because there was no one, in strict truth, to whom a goodbye was owed. The country northwest of Holloway's Bend rose in long, slow steps for the first 2 days. Oak scrub and grassland, and dry washes cut by cattle trails. And Charlotte rode at the mare's easy walking pace, and did not push her, because she knew the mare would have to carry her back as well as out. The first night she camped in the lee of a limestone outcrop, and boiled coffee over a small fire of dry oak, and ate biscuit and cheese, and slept in her bedroll, with the compass under her folded coat for a pillow. The wind that night smelled of dry grass and cold stone. On the second day the country began to fold. The washes deepened into small canyons, and the grass gave way in patches to pinyon and juniper, and by evening she could see the blue shoulders of the mountains ahead of her, still a long day's ride further on. On the third day she crossed a shallow creek, and watered the mare, and refilled her canteen, and ate her cheese, standing in the shade of a cottonwood, and she took a bearing off the second oldest of her maps, and adjusted her line 7 degrees to the west, and kept riding. The pines began that afternoon, first in scattered handfuls and then in stands, and the air changed, cooler and more resinous, and the light through the pine crowns fell in long, soft columns onto the needle floor. She had not seen a road since the morning of the second day. She had not seen a fence since noon. She saw a mule deer at dusk, and a red-tailed hawk that stooped and missed and lifted again. And once she saw the print of an unshod horse in a patch of mud beside the trail. And she got down and studied it and put her hand flat beside it for scale, and she thought it was perhaps 3 or 4 days old, and she remounted and rode on. The fourth night she made a cold camp in a stand of ponderosa, and did not risk a fire, because she could not have said why except that the country had begun to feel watched, and she lay in her bedroll with the compass in her hand, and turned it, and watched the needle settle in the moonlight, and settle again each time she turned it, and the needle told her only what it had always told her, which was where north was, and where north was where she was going. On the 5th morning she came up out of a shallow saddle, onto a bench of open grass, and she saw the mouth of the valley opening below her, exactly where the 4 old maps had said it would open, and she halted the mare, and sat very still in the saddle for a long moment, and she took the compass out of her pocket, and shot the bearing, and the bearing agreed. She rode down into the valley. The valley ran northwest between 2 low pine ridges, for perhaps 3 miles, and a creek moved along the middle of it under a thin skin of morning mist, and where the creek bent southward against the base of the farther ridge, Charlotte saw the town. She saw it before she was ready to see it. She saw the pitched shingle roofs of about a dozen buildings, arranged in 2 short rows along a single wagon street, and she saw the pale square of a whitewashed church at the far end with a small square belfry, and she saw thin blue threads of wood smoke lifting straight up out of 4 separate chimneys into the still air, and she saw a corral of peeled poles beside the nearest building, with 3 horses standing in it, and she saw a woman in a gray dress carrying a wooden bucket across the street from a pump to a door, and she saw a boy of perhaps 10 years driving 2 milk cows along a fence line with a switch. Charlotte sat the mare on the bench of grass and did not move. The compass in her pocket had not lied. The maps had not lied. The place existed. The place had gone on existing for 40 years, while the maps around it had quietly closed their mouths, and she was looking at it now, in ordinary morning light, with wood smoke rising and cows walking, and no part of it had the air of a ruin. She counted the roofs again. She counted 12 buildings and the church. She noted that the shingles on the nearest roof had been patched in 2 places, with cedar shakes cut a different length than the originals. She noted that the corral poles were peeled but weathered gray. She noted that the pump in the street was iron, and that the handle had been recently greased, because it caught the light differently than the rest. She sat there long enough that the boy with the cows saw her first and stopped, and then the woman with the bucket saw her, and set the bucket down, and did not pick it up again, And then a man came out of the door the woman had been walking toward, and stood in the street, looking up at her without his hat. And then 2 more people came out of 2 more doors, and none of them called to her, and none of them moved toward her, and none of them ran. They only stood and looked. Charlotte lifted her hand slowly, palm open, so they would see it. The man in the street lifted his hand in return. Charlotte touched the mare with her heel, and rode down the last slope into Briar Ridge at a walk. And the mare's hooves on the packed dirt of the wagon street were the loudest sound in the valley. The man who had lifted his hand was tall and lean, and perhaps 60, in a collarless shirt and suspenders and worn wool trousers, and he waited for her in the middle of the street until she drew rein 3 paces from him and swung down. He looked at the maps rolled in her saddle scabbard, and at the compass sleeve at her hip, and at her boots, and at her face, and then he said, quietly, that she was the first person to ride into the valley from outside in 9 years. He said his name was August Merrow, and that he had been the town's blacksmith, and was now what passed for its mayor, and he asked her, in the same quiet voice, how she had found them. Charlotte said the maps had never stopped showing them. August Merrow closed his eyes for a moment and opened them again, and he said, "Then we had better talk," and he asked the woman with the bucket, whose name was Naomi Hale, to see to the mare, and he walked Charlotte across the street to a low-frame house with a pitched shingle roof and a plank porch. He opened the door and stood aside for her. The house had 2 rooms. The front room held a wood stove, a plank table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books, and a narrow bed with a folded quilt. The back room, when he opened its door, held a drafting table under a north window, a stool, a walnut case of drafting instruments open on a side shelf, a wall pinned with hand-drawn sheets of the valley in different seasons, and a tin box beneath the table, full of pencils worn to stubs. Charlotte stopped in the doorway of the back room and did not step in. August Merrow said the room had belonged to a woman named Hester Ivy, who had been the town's mapmaker and postmistress for 31 years, and who had died the previous winter, and whose house had stood empty since. And he said Charlotte was welcome to it while she was in Briar Ridge, because he could not think what else to do with a mapmaker who had ridden in out of the pines with 4 old maps in her scabbard. He set her saddlebags inside the front door and left her there, and told her supper would be at the church at sundown, and he closed the door softly behind him. Charlotte stood a long time in the doorway of the back room before she went into it. She went to the drafting table first. The sheets pinned to the wall were done in a clean, patient hand she recognized as the hand of a person taught the same way she had been taught, with the same slope hatching and the same style of lettering, and along the bottom of each sheet was the same small, careful signature, H. Ivy, Briar Ridge. She sat down on the stool and looked around the room. The walnut case of instruments on the side shelf was German, the same maker as Otis Kerr's, and the dividers had been sharpened recently. The tin box of pencil stubs had been organized by length. On the shelf above the drafting table stood a row of cloth-bound field notebooks, each labeled by year in the same small hand, running from 1858 to 1917, and Charlotte counted them without touching them and found 59 notebooks in a row. She stood up after a while and walked slowly along the wall, and it was then that she saw that one of the floorboards under the drafting table did not lie quite flush with the others, and that its near end had been lifted often enough that the nail heads had been worked shiny by the pull of an iron. She knelt. She took her knife from her belt and slid the point along the seam and lifted the board. It came up easily. Beneath it, in a shallow cavity between the joists, sat a flat tin biscuit box painted with faded blue lilies, and, beside it, a small canvas sack tied at the neck with wax twine. And beneath both of them, folded twice, a single sheet of heavy paper, sealed with a drop of red wax. Charlotte lifted the paper first. She sat back on her heels on the pine floor, with the sheet across her knees, and broke the wax carefully with her thumbnail. The letter, when she unfolded it, was written in the same clean, patient hand as the signed maps on the wall, and the ink was still black, and the paper had been folded so recently that the crease had not yet begun to yellow. It read, "My name is Hester Ivy. I was born in Holloway's Bend in 1839, and I came into this valley with my father in 1858, when I was 19, and I have lived in this house and drawn the maps of this valley for 31 years. I learned my trade as a girl from a surveyor named Josiah Weaver, who walked the county lines with a chain and a Jacob's staff, and taught me to hatch a slope and shoot a bearing, and who was, I believe, a kind man. If you are reading this, you have come into Briar Ridge from outside, and you have found the loose board under my table, and you are therefore a map maker, because no one else looks under a mapmaker's table. In the tin is $140 in gold coin, which is every dollar I saved in 31 years, and which I leave to whoever finds this, because I have no children, and the town has no bank. In the sack are my father's silver watch, and the small brass rule he cut his first plat with. I am leaving them because I hope that whoever reads this will understand that Briar Ridge did not hide itself out of shame, and did not die, and was not lost, but was only forgotten by the country outside. And I hope that whoever reads this will be gentle with the people who are still here." Charlotte read the letter through once, and then she read it through again, and then she set it carefully on the floorboards beside her knee, and she put her hand flat against her chest over the pocket where the compass was, and she sat on the floor of Hester Ivy's back room in Briar Ridge for a long time without moving, because Josiah Weaver was the name of her grandfather, and the compass in her pocket was the compass he had left her, and Hester Ivy had been his student before Charlotte was born. When she stood, the light through the north window had shifted a hand's width across the drafting table, and she understood she had been sitting past noon. She wrapped the letter in a clean sheet from the tin box of pencils, set the biscuit box and the canvas sack back into the cavity, and fitted the floorboard down against its nails without hammering it. The gold was not hers yet, and would not be until she had done the work Hester Ivy had asked of her. She washed her face at the pump behind the house, brushed the dust from her coat, took the 4 old maps from her saddlebag, and walked down the wagon street to the church at sundown, as August Merrow had told her. Supper was laid on 2 long trestles in the church, and about 30 people sat down to it. August Merrow stood and said her name, Charlotte Weaver, and said she had come in from Holloway's Bend by compass and by the old maps, and that she was Josiah Weaver's granddaughter, which was a thing he had learned from her that afternoon, and which he offered now to the room as a fact worth knowing. An old woman at the far end of the trestle set down her spoon and said she remembered Josiah Weaver walking into the valley in the spring of 1856 with a chain over his shoulder. Her name was Prudence Dell. She was 81, and she had been a girl of 11 the year he came. After supper, Charlotte spread the 4 maps on the trestle under the lamps and asked the room to tell her what had happened. They told her in pieces. The road out of the valley had washed in a spring flood in 1908, taking the wagon bridge at the south end with it, and the county had never sent a crew because the county had forgotten they were owed one. The freight contractor had died the same year. The post office had closed its route in 1912, when Hester Ivy stopped writing the letters out because her hip had gone. A diphtheria winter in 1914 had taken 11 of them. No one had gone out for supplies since 1917, because the 2 men who might have gone were both past 70, and the younger men had left in earlier years for the railheads and had not come back. Charlotte listened and wrote nothing that night, and slept in Hester Ivy's narrow bed under the folded quilt. In the morning she began. She took the fresh notebook and the 2 sharpened pencils and walked every street of Briar Ridge, with August Merrow beside her. And she drew the town as it stood in 1926, building by building, marking which roofs were sound, and which were patched, and which needed shingling before winter. She counted the standing inhabitants, 41 souls. The youngest, a boy of 8 named Tobias Hale. The oldest, Prudence Dell, at 81. She wrote down what each household lacked. Naomi Hale, aged 34, a widow, needed salt and coffee and lamp oil. Ephraim Prine, aged 67, the town's carpenter, needed nails of the 10-penny size and a new file for his crosscut saw. The church needed hymnals, of which 4 remained for 30 singers, and a new rope for the bell. She rode out on the 3rd day with August Merrow and a young man named Reuben Fisk, aged 19, who knew the creek bottoms because he had trapped them since he was 12, and the 3 of them found the washed bridge and paced the gap, and Charlotte drew it to scale. The gap was 31 feet across a cut bank, 6 feet deep. Reuben Fisk said he had crossed it on foot in dry August by climbing down and up. Ephraim Prine, when they returned and Charlotte drew him the sketch, said he could frame a footbridge of peeled pine in 4 days if he had the hands, and that a wagon bridge would want stone piers and a season's work. They began with the footbridge. Reuben Fisk felled the pines. Ephraim Prine hewed the stringers with a broadaxe he had kept sharp for 30 years. August Merrow forged the bridge irons at the cold forge behind his shop, which he fired for the first time in 6 years, and the smoke of it drew 2 more men out of houses Charlotte had not yet counted, and both took up hammers. Naomi Hale brought bread and cold bacon to the creek at midday for 4 days running. Prudence Dell sat on a stump above the cut and told them where the flood of 1908 had put the old piers, because she remembered. On the 5th day, Charlotte walked across the finished footbridge with the compass in her pocket and the 4 old maps rolled under her arm, and she rode the bay mare south along the trace of the vanished road toward Holloway's Bend to send word. She was gone 11 days. She came back with a pack mule loaded with 10-penny nails and coffee and salt and lamp oil and a new bell rope and 6 hymnals bought with $12 of Hester Ivy's gold, and with a letter from Wilbur Ashe that she did not open until she was inside Hester's house. The letter said the county recorder acknowledged the existence of the settlement of Briar Ridge, that a survey of the washed road would be entered on the schedule for the following spring, that mail service would resume by monthly rider, beginning the 1st of the coming month, and that her position in the land office would be held for her return whenever she chose to make it. Charlotte folded the letter and put it in the tin box with Hester Ivy's pencil stubs. By the end of that first summer, the people of Briar Ridge knew her name and used it plainly. The monthly rider came in on the 1st Tuesday and went out on the 2nd, and Charlotte drew a fresh map of the valley on heavy paper and sent a copy to the land office and kept the original pinned to the wall of the back room above Hester Ivy's drafting table, signed C. Weaver, Briar Ridge, 1926. She took Hester's chair at the drafting table as she had taken Otis Kerr's, and the plats of the valley's holdings, 40 years unrecorded. She began to draw one by one, and the county acknowledged each as she filed it. She did not go back to the room above the milliner's shop. She wrote to her mother in the autumn to say she was staying, and enclosed a small sketch of the valley for the parlor shelf beside the old atlas. Small rituals formed around her, without her noticing, until they were already habits. Tobias Hale brought her a bucket of creek water each morning before school, and would not accept a penny for it. Prudence Dell came on Sunday afternoons and sat in the front room and told her the old names of the ridges and the creeks, and Charlotte wrote each name down. Ephraim Prine mended the porch step in October, without being asked. Naomi Hale taught her to bake bread in the wood stove and did not laugh at the first 2 loaves. August Marrow shod the bay mare in November and would take only a cup of coffee for it. In December the snow came into the valley, the way Prudence Dell had said it would, quietly and from the north, and it laid a clean sheet over the shingles of Hester Ivy's house, and over the pines, and over the wagon street, so that by morning Briar Ridge was drawn again, in the 2 colors of a winter map. Charlotte Weaver rose in the dark, lit the wood stove with kindling Ephraim Prine had split for her the week before, set the coffee pot on the plate, and went into the back room with a lamp. She sat down at the drafting table in Hester Ivy's chair and looked at the wall. Above her, the fresh map of the valley was pinned in its 4 corners with brass tacks, signed C. Weaver, Briar Ridge, 1926, and to the left of it were the older sheets in Hester Ivy's own hand, signed H. Ivy, and to the left of those was a smaller sheet, older than either, a rough plat of the head of the valley, with a chain scale, worked out in a neat surveyor's hand, and signed at the corner J. Weaver, 1856. Charlotte had found the sheet at the bottom of the 59 field notebooks in October, and she had pinned it up without saying anything to anyone. She took the compass out of her coat pocket and set it on the drafting table beside the lamp. The leather sleeve was worn shiny at the edges from 30 years in Otis Kerr's vest. The case was scratched, the glass was slightly clouded, and the needle, when she opened it, settled true to the north wall of the room, as it had settled every morning of her life since the spring Otis Kerr had died. She opened the tin box of pencil stubs, took out Wilbur Ash's folded letter, unfolded it once to read the line about her position being held for her return whenever she chose to make it, folded it again, and put it back. She did not need the position, and had not needed it since October, but she kept the letter because a mapmaker keeps what is written down. Then she lifted the floorboard under the drafting table with the tip of her knife, took out the small canvas sack, untied the waxed twine, and set Hester Ivy's father's silver watch and the small brass rule he had cut his first plat with on the table beside the compass. 2 objects from 2 strangers who had both loved someone they never got to see grow up. She sat looking at them a long time while the coffee began to sing on the stove in the front room. Wilbur Ash had told her that the place was a copyist's error and would not keep her position open indefinitely for a woman who wandered. Her father had turned the pages of an atlas on Sunday afternoons and told her a map was a promise. Otis Kerr had said once, of a difficult creek bend she had traced at 15, that it was a clean piece of work. Josiah Weaver, whom she had never met, had walked into this valley in 1856 with a chain over his shoulder and taught a girl named Hester Ivy to hatch a slope, and that girl had drawn maps of the valley for 31 years and had left $140 in gold under a floorboard for whoever came next, because the town had no bank and she had no children, and she had believed, plainly and without decoration, that someone would come. Charlotte Weaver was 24, and she had ridden out of Holloway's Bend with a compass in her pocket and 4 old maps in a tube, because 7 sheets in a land office had shown the same unnamed place at the same remote spot, and no current route had admitted it. She had ridden into a valley she had been warned did not exist, and she had found it standing, and 41 people in it who used her name plainly, and a chair at a drafting table under a north window that had been kept for her by a woman she had never met, who had been taught the trade by her grandfather. She put the watch and the brass rule back into the canvas sack, tied the waxed twine, laid the sack in the cavity beside the biscuit box, and fit the floorboard down. Then she picked up her pencil and drew. If you have sat with this story to the end, stay a moment longer, and if the work of it has meant something to you, subscribe to the channel and share it with one person who you think would want to hear a quiet story told slowly. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from, whether that is a kitchen in a city at midnight, or a porch in a small town in the late afternoon, or a truck cab pulled over at the edge of a road, because it matters to us to know the map of where these stories travel. We read the names of the places you write down. We read them the way Charlotte Weaver read the old sheets in the land office, looking for what is still there and has only been forgotten. And before you go, sit with this a moment. There is likely a place in your own life that the current maps do not admit. A person who was written out of the record, a room that was closed up, a skill that was handed to you by someone older who saw what you could do before anyone else did, a small object in a drawer that belonged to someone who loved you and did not live to see who you became. The world is quick to call such things errors, carried forward, phantoms, poor uses of a promising life. But sometimes the old sheets are right, and the new ones are only incomplete. And the road that washed out in a spring flood is still a road under the grass, and the town is still standing, and the chair at the drafting table has been kept for you. So the question we leave you with tonight is simply this. What place on your own map has never stopped being there, and when will you saddle the bay mare and ride out to sea?